The jet had been sitting in the same hangar for almost 3 weeks, and everyone on the base knew it. Even people who had nothing to do with aircraft maintenance felt the tension every time they walked past the large gray doors. Inside, under bright white lights, the F-22 Raptor rested in silence, looking perfect from the outside. Its smooth shape and sharp lines gave no hint that something deep inside it was wrong. For most people, the jet was a symbol of power and pride. For the engineers and technicians, it had become a problem that refused to go away. Every morning started the same. Teams gathered around the engine bay with tablets, printed charts, and tired faces. They ran tests, checked numbers, and argued quietly about possible causes. The engine would start, run for a short time, and then fail the same stress check. Not in a dramatic way. No fire, no loud explosion. Just a warning tone, a drop in readings, and another red mark on the report dot at first. Everyone thought it would be a quick fix. A sensor issue, maybe. Or a software mismatch. Those things happened. But as days passed, confidence began to fade. Contractors were called in. Senior specialists flew in from other bases. Each one arrived with hope, and each one left with frustration. The commander of the base tried not to show his concern, but it was there. He knew what the grounded jet meant. There was an upcoming readiness review, and every aircraft mattered. One jet down might not sound serious to outsiders, but in his world, it raised questions. Questions led to pressure. Pressure led to consequences. Late one evening, long after most of the hangar lights were turned off, the commander walked the floor alone. He stopped near the jet and looked at it in silence. He had seen aircraft his entire career. He trusted machines, but only when people understood them. Right now, this one was not understood. Across town, far away from the base lights and alarms. A very different evening was taking place in a small rented house near the edge of the city. A single dad was finishing dinner. The kitchen was modest. The paint on the walls was old, and the table had a slight wobble, but it was clean and warm. A child sat nearby, working slowly through homework, asking questions now and then. The man answered patiently, even when he was tired. He had learned to pace himself. Life had taught him that rushing only made things harder. After dinner, he washed the dishes, packed lunch for the next day, and checked the time. Everything followed a routine. It had to. Years ago, his evenings looked very different. Back then, nights were filled with engine noise, warning lights, and pressure that never really went away. He had been good at his job. Very good. But that life came with a cost, and when it ended, he didn't fight to stay connected to it. He never talked much about his past. Not because he was hiding anything, but because it felt finished. Those years belonged to another version of him. Now, his world was smaller, quieter, and more important in ways that didn't show up on reports back at the base. The situation grew more serious by the day. The engine failure didn't break rules. It didn't point clearly to any single fault. That made it worse. Modern systems were designed to tell you what was wrong. When they didn't, it meant something was being missed. Meetings became longer. Voices grew sharper. One engineer suggested grounding the jet permanently until a replacement engine arrived. That idea was quickly shut down. Replacement engines were not easy to get, and admitting defeat so early would look bad. The commander listened to every update, nodded, asked questions, and thanked everyone for their effort. But at night, alone in his office, he felt the weight of the problem settle on his shoulders. One night, unable to sleep, he went back through old records. Not just the recent ones, but older files stored deep in the system. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for. Sometimes experience told you to search without a clear reason. As he scrolled through reports from years ago, one document caught his attention. It described an engine issue during a deployment that looked familiar. The symptoms were not identical, but close enough to make him stop. The report was detailed, but written in plain language. It stood out because it didn't rely heavily on software data. Instead, it talked about sound changes, vibration feel, and heat behavior during startup. Things that were harder to measure, but just as real. At the bottom of the report was a name he hadn't seen in a long time. The commander leaned back in his chair. He remembered that technician. Not loud, not flashy, but dependable. Someone who noticed small things and trusted his experience, even when others disagreed. The file showed that after that deployment, the technician had left active service. No disciplinary notes, no issues, just a clean exit. Life moving on. The commander hesitated. Reaching out to someone who had been gone that long wasn't standard. There were procedures, chains of command, and pride to consider. But the jet still sat silent. And time was running out. The next morning, after another failed test, the commander made his decision. The phone call came in the early afternoon, right as the single dad was finishing work. He stared at the number for a moment before answering. It had been a long time since anyone from that world had called him. The voice on the other end was calm and respectful. No demands, no pressure, just a request to talk. As he listened, memories stirred. The smell of fuel, the hum of engines, the long nights when problems didn't wait for sleep. He felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, but responsibility. He didn't give an answer right away. He asked for time to think. That evening, after the child was asleep, he sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet except for the soft sound of traffic outside. He looked around at the life he had built. It wasn't impressive, but it was steady. And it was his. He knew going back, even briefly, meant reopening a door he had closed on purpose. It also meant leaving his child for long hours again, even if just for a short time. But he also knew what it felt like to walk away from a problem unfinished. The next morning, the commander received a message. Simple, polite. The single dad agreed to come in and take a look. No promises, no guarantees. When the message was read, a small sense of relief passed through the office. No one said it out loud, but hope returned in a quiet way. The jet still sat in the hangar, unchanged. But for the first time in weeks, it felt like someone new was about to listen to it. The single dad left his house early that morning, carrying only a small bag with a few essentials. He didn't bring tools or manuals. Those could be found at the base. What he carried was his experience, his memory of long nights in hangars, and the quiet confidence that sometimes the smallest detail made the biggest difference. Driving to the base, he felt the old mix of excitement and tension that he hadn't felt in years. He noticed the familiar hum of the city fading as he passed industrial areas, then the neat rows of houses giving way to fences, guard posts, and finally the wide runway stretching into the distance. The base looked the same as he remembered, yet everything felt heavier now. The weight of responsibility seemed to hang in the air, almost visible. When he arrived, the commander greeted him personally at the gate. There were no formalities, no high-level introductions, just a handshake and a quiet nod. The commander's face showed relief, tempered with concern. He had seen many people come and go in his career, but some problems weren't solved by rank or authority. Some problems needed someone who truly understood the machine. The single dad followed him through the hangar. The jet was the same as the day before, sitting silently under the bright lights. The engineers glanced up as he walked in. Some whispered among themselves. They had heard of the veteran, but most had never worked with him. They weren't sure what to expect. Could someone who had been gone for years really solve this? He didn't look around much. He went straight to the engine, crouched down, and ran his hands over familiar surfaces. His fingers paused over certain panels, knobs, and bolts. Not everything was identical to what he remembered, but enough was the same. He began to speak quietly, almost to himself, noting things that had been overlooked. A slight wobble in a mount, a sensor alignment that seemed too tight, a heat discoloration barely visible under the light. The engineers watched silently. Some were skeptical. They had charts, diagrams, and digital readouts. They had followed procedures step by step, yet the engine kept failing. Watching a retired technician point to small, nearly invisible details felt strange. But there was something about the way he moved, the way he noticed things, that demanded attention. After a while, he stepped back and asked for the logs from previous tests. The screen showed numbers, graphs, and charts that had been reviewed dozens of times already. Most people would have glanced and moved on. He studied them carefully, tracing patterns and inconsistencies over time. His mind worked differently now, not relying only on software, but on instinct shaped by years of experience. He asked simple questions that made people pause. When did this start? Was there anything unusual before the failure? Any new parts or adjustments recently? They answered, sometimes uncertain. Some of the answers were things they hadn't noticed themselves. The single dad nodded and scribbled notes in a small notebook, using his own shorthand about hours past. The engineers took turns explaining what they had tried. Replacement sensors, recalibration, new software, tightening and loosening bolts in specific sequences. Each time. The veteran listened, then asked one more question. Nothing complicated, nothing that seemed revolutionary. Just observation, repetition, and careful thought. The atmosphere shifted slowly. Skepticism turned into curiosity. People who had rolled their eyes at first now leaned in. Something about his calm, deliberate approach was grounding. There was no rushing, no trying to impress. Just focused dot by late afternoon, he had identified a few areas that needed further inspection. One was minor on paper, but significant in effect. A small alignment issue deep inside the engine that no sensor could fully measure. The kind of thing that could cause repeated failures, yet go unnoticed by routine diagnostics. He explained it simply to the engineers. No technical jargon, no unnecessary detail. Just clear, precise instructions. The team worked carefully under his guidance. Every adjustment was slow, deliberate. Every measurement was double-checked. It felt almost like a dance, a silent rhythm that only came with experience. As the day turned into evening, the veteran paused and looked around. He noticed tired faces and stiff shoulders. He smiled faintly and said, "We're close. Just a few more steps." It wasn't a promise, but it gave people hope. Hope had been missing for weeks. The commander observed quietly from a distance. He had made the call to bring this man in because he trusted experience over procedure, intuition over protocol. Watching the veteran work, he realized he had made the right choice. Sometimes the people who mattered most were not the ones in rank or position, but the ones who knew the machine intimately and had the courage to trust what they knew. The work continued late into the night. The hangar lights reflected on metal panels, tools, and screens. Occasionally, the single dad would pause, scratch his head, or run his hands over a part, muttering to himself. Each time he did, engineers leaned closer, learning not just the steps, but the mindset, the patience, attention, and understanding needed to really see the problem. At one point, he asked for an old report from several years ago. It had been filed during a deployment, detailing a similar engine anomaly. As he read, his eyes moved quickly, noting every observation, every correction made at the time. There were small things that most people would have skipped, but he remembered them. Every detail mattered. Some of these patterns, they're familiar, he said quietly, almost to himself. He traced the notes on the screen with a finger. We missed a few signs early on. The engineers exchanged glances. Some looked worried, others intrigued. For the first time, they realized the problem wasn't a single part, but a combination of small factors, each minor on its own, but dangerous together. That was why the engine kept failing. The veteran began planning the next step. He didn't rush. He instructed carefully, explaining why each adjustment mattered. He encouraged questions and double-checking, even from the youngest technicians. Mistakes could be costly, and he wanted everyone involved to understand exactly what they were doing. By midnight, small progress had been made. The engine was partially reassembled with new adjustments. Initial tests were planned for the next morning. Everyone left the hangar with a sense of cautious optimism. For the first time in weeks, the problem felt solvable. Driving home after the shift, the single dad thought about his life outside the base, about the child waiting for him, about the quiet apartment and the routines he had built. The world he had left behind seemed far away, yet it had shaped him in ways he now realized were still valuable. He knew the next day would be critical. The first run would show whether his observations were correct. If the engine failed again, it could mean more pressure, more questions, and a reminder that even the best experience sometimes wasn't enough. But he also knew something else. He had seen enough machines, enough problems, to know that solutions often come not from force or tools, but from patience, observation, and understanding. Back at the base, the commander walked the hangar one last time before heading to his office. He looked at the jet and the small group of engineers preparing for the first test run. He felt a quiet sense of relief. It was not victory, not yet, but it was hope. Hope born from experience, trust, and the willingness of one person to step in when the rest of the world was stuck. The night passed with quiet anticipation. Lights remained on in the hangar, illuminating the jet like a monument waiting for a decision. Tools were arranged carefully. Notes were checked, double-checked, and then set aside. Everyone knew that tomorrow could change everything or nothing. And in a small house, miles away, a child slept peacefully, unaware that the parent's skills, long dormant, were about to be tested once again. The single dad thought of this as he finally drifted off to sleep. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel both the weight of responsibility and the quiet excitement that came with knowing he could make a difference. It was a long night. But when dawn came, it would bring the first chance to see whether experience, patience, and careful observation could succeed where countless tests, charts, and protocols had failed. And that first run would set the stage for the next steps that no one, not even the commander, could predict fully. The morning arrived cold and quiet, with mist lingering over the runway. Inside the hangar, the single dad veteran arrived early, carrying only his notebook and a steady sense of focus. He didn't rush. He never did. The engineers were already there, setting up equipment and running preliminary checks. Their faces showed nervous energy. Some had barely slept, knowing today could mark a turning point. The jet sat in the same place, gleaming under the lights. From a distance, it looked untouched, almost serene. But the veteran's eyes saw what others often missed: subtle signs in the metal, faint discoloration, and the tiniest unevenness in panels. He crouched by the engine bay, touching parts that had been handled hundreds of times before. His hands felt the vibrations, the heat, the weight of the machinery. It was a conversation with metal, wires, and oil. Listen to it, he told one of the younger engineers, his voice calm but commanding attention. The engineer tilted his head, unsure. It's just off, the veteran continued. Not loudly, not obvious, but it's there if you pay attention. The engineers leaned closer. Some whispered to each other, skeptical at first, but as they watched, they realized he wasn't guessing. He had an instinct honed over years of experience, knowing how a machine should feel, sound, and respond. He spent the next hour walking through every inch of the engine bay, checking mounts, cables, and valves. He asked questions that seemed simple, but forced the team to think differently. What was replaced last? Did we test in cold and hot cycles? Did anyone notice vibration changes over long runs? They answered carefully, recounting tests they had already performed. But he listened, nodded, and made notes, his mind connecting small details that others hadn't considered together. At one point, he paused, staring at a small panel that many had overlooked. It was worn slightly, the edges frayed from repeated handling. He crouched lower, shining a flashlight into the gap. His eyes narrowed. "There's something here," he murmured. "Not broken, not completely, but it's not right either." He called over one of the engineers. "I need you to watch carefully. Don't touch anything yet. Just observe." The engineer did, though tension ran through his shoulders. He had been through tests, simulations, and stress runs. Nothing seemed to work. Yet here, in a quiet corner, the veteran seemed to see what everyone else missed. Slowly, deliberately, he began explaining. "Look at the way this part moves. It's subtle. Under normal operation, it would align differently. The sensors read numbers that look fine, but the real movement, it's off. A tiny misalignment like this can cause cascading failures." The words were simple, but they made the engineers pause. Most had been trained to follow manuals, charts, and sensors. They were taught to trust the data. But the veteran was showing them that numbers alone didn't tell the whole story. Experience could notice things machines could not. Over the next several hours, the team worked together under his direction. Each step was slow, careful, methodical. Nothing was rushed. He guided them through minor adjustments, asking them to watch, to feel, to listen. Occasionally, he would pause and step back, hands on his hips, studying the entire setup. "Every machine has a rhythm," he explained quietly. "When you understand it, you know when something is wrong before the numbers tell you." This one's rhythm was off. That's why every automated test failed. The engineers nodded, some still silently skeptical, but others were already learning. They began to see that success today would not come from brute force or following steps blindly. It would come from careful observation, intuition, and patience. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the veteran asked for the original maintenance logs from the jet's first deployment. Engineers handed them over. He spread the papers out, scanning each one quickly, noting discrepancies between the logs and the digital files. "See this?" he asked, pointing to a minor note buried in a paragraph. "It seems insignificant, but this line tells us that a subtle adjustment was made years ago during deployment. It wasn't recorded in later reports. That's why the issue keeps recurring." The engineers leaned in, astonished. Something so small, so easily overlooked, had caused weeks of frustration. The veteran didn't celebrate. He simply nodded and continued, his mind already moving to the next step. By late afternoon, he had pieced together a theory. It wasn't just one part. It wasn't just a sensor or a valve. It was a combination of factors, small misalignments, minor wear, and overlooked adjustments that together caused the engine to fail. Repeatedly under stress. He explained the plan in plain language. "We need to realign these sections carefully, retest the sensor calibration, and monitor how it behaves under heat and vibration. Do it slowly. Check twice. Move once. If we do it right, the jet will run." No one doubted him now. Not openly. They saw the certainty in his actions, the depth of his knowledge, and the quiet confidence that only comes from experience. He didn't ask for respect or authority. He earned it through what he did, step by step. The adjustments began. The team worked together, guided by his instructions. The hangar was filled with the hum of tools, quiet conversation, and careful concentration. Each movement was measured. Each check was repeated. The veteran moved among the team, observing, correcting, encouraging. By evening, progress was visible. The engine no longer had the subtle wobble that had plagued it for weeks. Sensors read stable, heat distribution appeared normal, and vibration tests were consistent. The veteran took a step back, hands on his knees, breathing slowly. He wasn't done, but the pattern of failure was disappearing. The commander walked into the hangar just as the sun dipped below the horizon. He had been in his office, reviewing reports and worrying about the upcoming readiness inspection. Seeing the veteran at work, surrounded by engineers who were now fully engaged, gave him a small, quiet relief. "Progress?" he asked, voice low. "Significant," the veteran replied without looking up. "But the real test will be tomorrow, when we run a full system check under stress conditions." The commander nodded. He understood. Nothing was over yet. Machines could be unpredictable. Procedures could fail. But he also knew that this man, quiet and deliberate, had already accomplished what others could not. As the hangar emptied late in the night, the veteran stayed behind. He reviewed notes, checked measurements, and prepared instructions for the team the next morning. The lights reflected off the metal panels, creating a warm glow in the otherwise quiet space. Outside, the city slept, unaware that a single man was quietly solving a problem that had stumped an entire base. He thought about his life, his child, a quiet apartment waiting for him, and the strange balance he now maintained between these two worlds. One was ordinary, predictable, and comforting. The other was intense, high stakes, and full of pressure. He had moved between them before, and now he was doing it again, carefully, deliberately. When he finally left the hangar, it was late. The streets were empty. The air was crisp. He drove home slowly, thinking about the steps he had taken, the small adjustments that had made a difference, and the next day, when the engine would finally speak under full load, he arrived home to find his child awake, waiting for a bedtime story. For a moment, the tension of the day faded. He smiled, sat on the couch, and began to read, allowing the ordinary world to reclaim a little space in his life. But even as he turned the pages, his mind drifted back to the hangar, to the jet, to the tiny misalignments, and to the knowledge that the next day would tell him whether weeks of careful work would succeed. He knew the stakes. He knew the pressure. He knew the eyes of the base would be on that engine, on that test, and on him. And yet, he felt calm. He trusted the work. He trusted the process. And most importantly, he trusted himself. The night passed with quiet determination. In the darkness, the hangar waited. The jet waited. And the single dad veteran, half in one world and half in another, slept lightly, ready to return the next morning to continue a task that required patience, experience, and a steady heart. Tomorrow would be the day that revealed whether his observations, instincts, and careful planning were enough to finally solve a problem that had stumped everyone else. And deep down, he knew that the solution would not be flashy or dramatic. It would be subtle, precise, and grounded in understanding, a reflection of the way he approached everything in life. The next morning, the hangar was alive with quiet urgency. The single dad veteran arrived before sunrise, the pale light filtering through the high windows, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. He carried nothing but his notebook, a small flashlight, and an unshakable calm. The engineers were already at their stations, checking equipment and running last-minute diagnostics. Everyone knew today was the moment of truth. The jet sat like a sleeping giant, its body gleaming under the harsh lights. From a distance, it looked calm, almost serene, but the veteran knew better. The engine contained hidden problems, ones that no sensor or chart could fully describe. And yet, he also knew that he was close to a solution. He crouched beside the engine, letting his hands glide over panels, mounts, and bolts, feeling vibrations with a sensitivity only years of experience could teach. He spoke softly to the engineers. "Watch closely. Don't rush. The tiniest movement can tell you more than any chart." For weeks, teams had tried everything. They had replaced parts, recalibrated sensors, and run test after test. But the engine kept failing. Each failure added tension, frustration, and doubt. Today, the veteran's eyes were scanning for the one small irregularity that could make all the difference. He noticed it almost immediately. A subtle misalignment deep inside the engine, one that was invisible unless you were looking carefully and knew exactly what to feel for. It wasn't a catastrophic problem. Nothing broken. Nothing loose. But the position was just slightly off, enough to disrupt the flow and cause repeated failures. He called over the commander quietly, pulling him aside. "This is it," he said. "This alignment is the problem. Standard procedures don't catch it, and most tests won't reveal it. If we correct this carefully, the engine will run. But it's delicate. One wrong move, and we could have a bigger issue." The commander looked at him, weighing the risks. He had a choice to make. Trust the veteran, who had left active service years ago, over all the standard protocols, or continue following procedures that had failed for weeks. He saw the confidence in the veteran's eyes, but he also saw the weight of the responsibility he was about to share. "I trust you," the commander said finally. "Do what you need. But we move slowly. We double-check everything." The veteran nodded, then turned to the engineers. "We proceed carefully. Every adjustment is measured. Watch what I do and repeat exactly." The process began. Each movement was deliberate. The team worked together like a single unit, guided by his quiet instructions. A tiny shift here, a precise tightening there, every action measured and rechecked. Sweat formed on brows as the tension built. Everyone knew that this moment could decide the success or failure of weeks of work. Hours passed. The veteran moved among the team, observing, correcting, and encouraging. He asked simple questions that forced the engineers to think, to notice, to engage with the machine in a way they hadn't before. "Listen to it again," he said at one point, pausing mid-adjustment. "Hear the difference? Subtle, yes, but important. That sound tells us we are on the right path." The younger engineers looked at each other, astonished. They had been trained to trust charts, sensors, and digital readouts. Now they realized there was knowledge that no chart could capture. The veteran's approach wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was quiet, careful, and precise. And it was working. By late afternoon, the adjustments were complete. Every bolt, mount, and sensor had been checked twice. The internal alignment was corrected, the engine assembled carefully, and the team stepped back. Silence fell over the hangar. For weeks, the space had been filled with frustration, noise, and repeated failure. Now, there was only anticipation. The veteran turned to the commander. "We test now, slowly, step by step. Watch every reading." The test began. Lights flickered, panels hummed, and the engine started. It ran longer than any test in the past 3 weeks. Sensors stabilized. Temperatures remained within safe limits. Vibrations were minimal. The engineers exchanged glances, barely daring to speak. They had never heard the engine run this smoothly under test conditions. The veteran moved closer, listening carefully, checking readings, and observing every detail. "Keep monitoring. Don't celebrate yet." A small problem could still appear. Minutes passed. then 10 minutes. The engine continued to run without any sign of failure. Confidence began to grow quietly. The veteran nodded to himself. Everything was behaving exactly as expected. The misalignment had been the root cause. Correcting it had resolved weeks of frustration. The commander stepped forward, a mixture of relief and pride in his eyes. "You did it," he said softly. "I didn't think anyone could." The veteran shook his head. "We did it." The team followed the steps, double-checked everything, and stayed focused. That's why it worked. The engineers felt a wave of quiet satisfaction. They had learned something more than just a technical solution. They had learned about patience, careful observation, and the value of experience. They realized that sometimes the solution wasn't in more tests, more sensors, or more rules. It was in paying attention, noticing the small details, and trusting someone who understood the machine deeply. The rest of the afternoon was spent running additional tests to ensure the solution held under various conditions. The engine performed flawlessly. Data was collected, charts were updated, and the team began to relax, though carefully. Everyone had learned that even small overconfidence could be dangerous. Finally, the veteran stepped back and allowed himself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. He didn't smile broadly, didn't make a show of triumph. Instead, he quietly reviewed his notes, made a few final checks, and prepared instructions for the engineers for the next day. The commander approached him again. "I want to recognize you publicly," he said. "But you don't want that, do you?" The veteran shook his head. "I'm here to help. Recognition isn't necessary. The important thing is the jet runs, and the team learns something they can carry forward." The commander nodded, understanding more than words could convey. He had seen many people in his career. Some sought glory. Some sought approval. Few worked quietly, with focus and responsibility, solving problems that no one else could dot. As the hangar emptied, the team talking quietly among themselves, the veteran returned to his routines. Outside the base, the city was quiet. He drove home slowly, thinking about the delicate adjustments, the tension in the hangar, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing the engine perform as it should dot at home. His child ran to greet him. For a moment, the world of high stakes and technical precision fell away. He smiled, hugged the child, and helped with dinner. Yet even as he laughed and shared the evening, his mind drifted to the next day final system checks, flight clearance, and the remaining steps to ensure the jet was fully operational. He thought about responsibility, about trust, about how a single small misalignment had caused so much trouble, and how careful observation and patience had solved it. Life, he realized, often worked the same way. Small details mattered. Attention and care could make the difference between success and failure. That night, after the child slept, he sat quietly reviewing notes one last time. He reflected on the day's events, the tension, the anticipation, and the careful precision that had finally solved a problem others had thought impossible. He felt a quiet satisfaction, but also humility. He had not done it alone. The team, the engineers, and even the commander's trust had been part of the solution. Tomorrow, the jet would take its next step. Flight tests would follow. The world would see the results, but the real story was the patience, skill, and careful observation that had made success possible. And he knew that even if no one celebrated it publicly, he had made a difference. As he finally turned off the lights in his quiet apartment, he reflected on the unusual balance of his life. A single dad, ordinary in one world, extraordinary in another. One world demanded patience, care, and love. The other demanded focus, experience, and attention to detail. And somehow, he had learned to navigate both, quietly making a difference without seeking recognition. The night passed, filled with calm determination. The jet awaited, ready for the final tests. The engineers had learned more than technical skills. They had learned what it meant to see, to notice, and to trust experience over procedure when necessary. And somewhere in the quiet of the city, a single dad slept lightly, ready to return the next day to ensure that the jet, the team, and the mission all moved forward safely. The risk had been high. The stakes had been higher. But through careful observation, patience, and precise action, he had proven that some problems were solved, not by strength, not by tools, but by knowing exactly where to look, what to feel, and how to act. The hangar was quiet again, but this time the quiet was different. It was not filled with tension or frustration. It was filled with anticipation. The F-22 Raptor, the aircraft that had refused to cooperate for weeks, now rested fully repaired, humming with potential. The single dad veteran arrived early, as always, walking slowly along the floor, glancing at every detail. The engine adjustments he had made were in place, and the team had double-checked everything overnight. Today, the final test flight would prove whether all the work had succeeded. The engineers and technicians were already at their stations. They spoke in low voices, careful not to break the fragile sense of calm. The veteran didn't rush. He observed quietly, checking readings, watching dials, listening for anything that might indicate trouble. His mind was calm, focused. Years of experience had taught him that rushing often led to mistakes. Patience, careful observation, and steady hands would win the day. The commander arrived shortly after, his usual composed presence mixed with a trace of excitement. He had trusted the veteran to guide the team through what many thought impossible. Now he watched quietly, waiting to see if that trust had been justified. The pilot assigned for the test flight approached the jet. He had briefed and prepared for weeks, but even he felt a flutter of nerves. Flying an F-22 was always a responsibility, but today it carried more weight. The engine had been stubborn, defying every test. Everyone knew that even a small miscalculation could have consequences. The veteran walked to the side of the jet, kneeling by the engine for a final check. He ran his hands along the panels, listened carefully, and nodded to himself. Everything was exactly as it should be. He didn't say much. He simply motioned to the pilot that the jet was ready. The pilot responded with a firm nod, appreciation evident in his eyes. Before the engine roared to life, the veteran spoke quietly to the team. Remember everything we observed. Watch the readings. Stay alert. But don't interfere unless it's necessary. Let it speak for itself. The pilot climbed into the cockpit. The canopy closed with a soft click, and the engine ignited. At first, the sound was steady, calm. The hum of the F-22 filled the hangar, vibrating through the floor. The engineers held their breath. The readings on the screens were normal. Heat levels were perfect. Vibration was minimal. The jet was responding exactly as it should. Steady, the veteran said softly, leaning back against the support beam. His eyes never left the displays. His hands were tucked in his pockets, relaxed but ready. He had seen enough machines, enough engines, to know that nothing should be taken for granted, not even now. Minutes passed, then 10. The jet continued to run without a single fault. Engineers exchanged glances, a mixture of relief and disbelief on their faces. Weeks of frustration, countless failed tests, and sleepless nights were suddenly replaced by quiet triumph. The veteran watched as the pilot taxied the jet slowly down the runway for initial movement tests. The hangar doors opened, letting in the morning sunlight. Dust and mist caught in the beams of light as the jet rolled forward. Every reading stayed within safe limits. The pilot executed a few gentle maneuvers, and the jet responded perfectly. The commander allowed himself a small smile. He had trusted a man who had been gone from active service for years, a single dad living a quiet life over all the protocols and procedures that had failed. Now he saw why. Experience, calm focus, and careful observation had solved what no one else could. As the jet returned and taxied back to the hangar, the pilot climbed out, his face serious but smiling. "It's perfect," he said simply. The engineers gathered around the veteran, some placing hands on his shoulders, others shaking his hand, some just nodding silently in appreciation. They had learned more than just a technical lesson. They had learned what focus, experience, and patience could achieve. The veteran remained calm, accepting their gratitude with quiet humility. He didn't seek recognition. The success of the engine, the performance of the jet, and the safety of the pilot were recognition enough. The day continued with additional tests, each one confirming the engine's stability and performance. By afternoon, it was clear. The jet was ready for full operational flight. The airbase, which had been tense for weeks, now buzzed with cautious celebration. News would eventually spread, but for now, it was enough to know that the problem had been solved. The commander pulled the veteran aside. "I know you don't want attention," he said quietly, "but you've earned respect beyond words. I want you to know that. You've done more than repair an engine. You've reminded all of us what true skill and focus can do." The veteran nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I didn't do it alone," he said. "The team followed, checked, and stayed alert. That's why it worked." Even as praise was offered, the veteran thought of home, of quiet evenings, of meals prepared and homework checked, of a life that, though ordinary in many ways, had meaning that no awards or recognition could replace. He had come here to help, not to reclaim a past he had left behind. And now, having solved the problem, he could return to that life, at least for a little while. Later, the hangar emptied, leaving only the jet and the veteran. He walked along its side, touching the smooth panels, remembering the weeks of struggle and the careful adjustments that had led to this moment. Machines did not need praise, but they remembered the care and attention given to them. The jet would perform perfectly because it had been understood, respected, and corrected with precision. He left the hangar and walked to his car. Outside, the sun was high, warming the concrete and casting long shadows. Engineers and pilots went about their work, some still quietly discussing what had happened, others smiling and shaking heads in disbelief. Everyone knew they had witnessed something unusual, a problem solved not by procedure or brute force, but by careful observation, patience, and experience. The drive home was calm. The veteran thought about the child waiting for him, about bedtime stories, quiet meals, and the ordinary routines that defined his life. The extraordinary work at the base had been important, even necessary. But the life he had built outside those walls mattered just as much, maybe more. He arrived home to a small apartment, simple and warm. His child ran to greet him, excited, energetic, and happy. For a moment, the world of engines, hangars, and F-22s faded away. The veteran smiled, hugged the child, and joined in the laughter, letting the ordinary moments fill him with quiet contentment. After dinner, as the child drifted off to sleep, the veteran sat alone for a while, reflecting. The engine, the jet, the team, they had all succeeded because of careful work, attention to detail, and calm focus under pressure. He thought about responsibility, trust, and the quiet power of experience. Recognition would come later, perhaps in reports, memos, or casual conversations. But it didn't matter. He had reminded the world that some people, some skills, and some forms of knowledge were not measured by rank, awards, or attention. They were measured by results, by quiet effectiveness, and by the willingness to act when others could not. He made a few notes for himself, small reminders about what worked, what could have been done differently, and lessons to carry forward. He thought about the engineers, the commander, and the pilot. They had all grown in understanding, seeing firsthand the value of patience, observation, and skill. Outside, the city was quiet. Lights twinkled in distant buildings. The streets were calm. The world had moved on, unaware of the silent triumph that had taken place at the airbase. And that was perfectly fine. The veteran didn't need applause. The knowledge that he had made a difference, that a problem once thought unsolvable had been corrected, was enough. As he finally turned off the lights in his apartment, he allowed himself a deep breath. He had balanced two worlds, one of extraordinary responsibility, one of ordinary life. Both mattered. Both defined him. And both were worth the effort. Tomorrow, he would return to the base for a final review, to ensure all procedures were documented and that the team was prepared for any future issues. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply be a parent, to simply be present, to simply be satisfied with knowing that skill, patience, and calm focus had once again made a difference in the world. Even if quietly, without fanfare. The child slept peacefully. The apartment was warm, and somewhere miles away, the F-22 sat ready, its engine steady and reliable. The veteran had completed what no one else could, and yet he had not sought praise, glory, or attention. He had acted because it needed to be done, because experience mattered, and because sometimes ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The night passed with quiet satisfaction. The mission was complete. The jet was ready. The team had learned lessons they would never forget, and the single dad veteran returned to his life, knowing that the world had been made a little safer, a little better by his quiet, careful work. In that balance between the ordinary and extraordinary, he found peace. He had proven that real heroes often worked silently, guided not by recognition, but by understanding, skill, and responsibility. And in his small apartment, with the soft breathing of a child nearby, he knew that was enough.